Most organizations assume SharePoint automation scales because it's in the platform. They are wrong. The UI makes it feel small, one library, one button, one approval, but the moment you automate, you've built an enterprise control plane that executes decisions, changes permissions, and moves data across compliance boundaries. In the next hour, this becomes obvious, how QuickStep's workflows and agents actually behave at scale, and how identity, labels, DLP, and observability either enforce intent or let entropy win. Stop thinking features, start thinking systems. The foundational misunderstanding: SharePoint is a workflow surface, not a repository. The foundational mistake is treating SharePoint like a place where files live. Architecturally, SharePoint is a workflow surface. Content plus metadata plus permissions plus policy, all sitting in front of a distributed execution engine. That sounds abstract, but it explains almost every "we didn't expect that" incident an enterprise has with automation. A document library is not a folder tree with version history. It's an event source. Every upload, edit, metadata update, approval change, sharing link, and access request is a signal you can wire into Power Automate, graph subscriptions, logic apps, functions, or an agent experience. The second you do that, the blast radius changes. A simple flow isn't just sending an email, it's now an integration between identity, policy, and data movement running at machine speed without the human friction that used to slow mistakes down. This is why automation sprawl is inevitable if you don't design for it. SharePoint makes it easy to add triggers. Teams makes it easy to add notifications. Power Automate makes it easy to glue it together. And then the organization wakes up 6 months later with 3 versions of the same approval, 7 different notify the channel workflows, and an unspoken rule that nobody touches the flows because nobody knows which business process will break. That's not a tooling failure. That's what happens when execution grows faster than intent. Now layer in the new reality: deterministic automation versus probabilistic automation. Deterministic automation is the old model. The system follows explicit rules. If a file enters this library, set metadata. If status becomes approved, move it. If label equals confidential, block external sharing. Boring, predictable, auditable. The kind of automation you can defend in an incident review because you can point to inputs, outputs, and logs. Probabilistic automation is the agentic model. An agent reads context, infers meaning, chooses a next action, and may do different things for 2 files that look similar to a human. The system becomes helpful, but you've traded a rules engine for a reasoning engine. That distinction matters because governance mechanisms designed for deterministic flows don't automatically constrain probabilistic decisioning. They just make you feel like they do. So SharePoint isn't becoming smarter automation. It's becoming a place where decisions happen closer to the data. That's powerful. It's also how organizations accidentally build a parallel IT estate. Thousands of micro workflows embedded in sites, lists, libraries, chats, and personal environments. Each one seems harmless. Collectively, they form an authorization graph and an execution graph you didn't model, didn't test, and can't explain to an auditor. This is where the workflow surface idea clicks. SharePoint is the user-facing layer where business intent gets translated into machine action. QuickSteps turn a column into a button. Approvals turn a pill-shaped status into a gate. Integrated workflow UX turns "I'm in this library" into pre-wired connectors and templates. And because it's in context, people use it more. Usage goes up, volume goes up, variance goes up. And variance is where scale dies. Because what scales isn't a flow. What scales is a pattern: consistent eventing, consistent identity boundaries, consistent data classification, consistent enforcement, and consistent observability. Without that, you don't have automation. You have conditional chaos. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you let SharePoint automation evolve organically, you will eventually lose the ability to answer basic questions. Who can trigger this action? Which identity performs the write? Where does the data go next? What policy was evaluated? What evidence exists that it happened correctly? If you can't answer those, you are not operating a workflow platform. You are operating a rumor. So the goal of this blueprint is not to teach buttons or templates. It's to define the building blocks before you choose tools. What SharePoint emits as events, how decisions should be made, where orchestration should live, and how enforcement survives human creativity. Once that model is clear, QuickSteps and agents stop being cool features. They become controlled interfaces to a system you can actually run. The modern automation stack: QuickSteps, approvals, flows, agents. SharePoint's modern automation stack looks simple because Microsoft intentionally hid the wiring. That's the selling point. It's also the risk. So the only sane way to talk about QuickSteps, approvals, workflows, and agents is as layers of the same system: an action surface, a gate, an orchestration engine, and an interface that pretends it isn't an interface. Start with QuickSteps. QuickSteps are the in-grid action layer, repeatable actions exposed where the work happens, directly on list items and files. People used to do this with custom column formatting and JSON buttons. Now it's a first-class column type. And it matters because the grid is where users live. If an action sits in the ribbon, it's optional. If it sits next to the file, it becomes the way we do things. The simple version is quick steps remove friction. They also remove deliberation. A quick step can set a value, move a file, draft an email, start a Teams chat, and this is the one that changes the game: execute a flow. And Microsoft explicitly called out that execute flow quick steps don't have to be constrained to the default environment. That means the button in the library can trigger automation you're not even mentally associating with that site. That distinction matters because you're no longer governing flows. You're governing invocation points. Next layer, lightweight approvals. These approvals live in the list or library, presented as a pill-shaped status column. Admins or owners can enable them with a toggle and then define default approvers. They can even stage and sequence those approvers so the approval happens in an assigned order. The UX feels harmless. Click submit, a Teams notification goes out and the status updates. But architecturally, you've just created a state machine embedded in metadata. And that's the value. It keeps the workflow state with the item instead of scattering it across email threads, Teams chats, and personal spreadsheets. It also creates a consistent governance surface. Approval requested, pending, approved, rejected. That's something you can audit, something you can query, something you can enforce downstream. But don't confuse built-in with enterprise grade by default. Approval routing still depends on identity and permissions. Approver selection still creates an implicit authorization model. And the moment someone asks for exceptions, this library needs a different approver for this client, or skip step 2 if it's under $5,000. You're back to the same question: where does branching logic live and who owns it? Now the workflows UX spont. Microsoft is bringing the workflows app-style experience into SharePoint, templates, and a build-from-scratch path directly in the context of a list or library. The selling point is that connections are pre-configured. It already knows where you are, what the list is, what the trigger should be. So makers don't have to do the sign in, pick site, pick library dance. That convenience is not cosmetic. It's an acceleration mechanism. More people can build automations. More automations will exist, and more of them will be created by the people least equipped to think about blast radius, error handling, and long-term ownership. That's not a criticism of makers. That's the predictable outcome of lowering the barrier. Also, the templates are Microsoft provided, and you can't necessarily modify the internal structure of a template. So what happens? People start from scratch when the template doesn't fit. And start from scratch is where abstraction ends and flow complexity begins. Loops, parallel branches, throttling, connector limits, and those quiet failures nobody notices until finance asks why invoices didn't move for 3 days. Now, the agent layer. Every SharePoint site effectively gains an agent-shaped interface. A site-specific knowledge surface that can answer questions grounded in what the user can access. Then you get higher-order patterns, a knowledge agent that helps curate, tag, and structure content, and an admin agent that watches for oversharing, inactive sites, and permission sprawl. Agents are not the automation engine. They are the front door to the automation engine. They turn "I need to do a thing" into a guided action or a triggered workflow or a routed approval, which is great until you treat them as the backend. Don't. The agent is where humans ask. Deterministic orchestration is where the enterprise executes. So the modern stack is coherent if you see it as one pipeline. Quick steps and workflows provide the user's handholds, approvals provide lightweight state, Power Automate and Azure provide execution, and agents provide the conversational wrapper. And when you standardize that model, the feature list stops being exciting. It becomes governable. Conceptual flow for scale, event, reasoning, orchestration, enforcement. Scale starts with a boring question: what exactly happened? Not what did the user want? Not what does the business process say? What happened in the system that you can point to, subscribe to, and replay? That's the event. In SharePoint land, events come from a few predictable places. A file was created, updated, moved, or deleted. Metadata changed. An approval state changed. A sharing link was created. Permissions changed. A page was published. A list item changed. The UI hides that these are all distinct signals with different reliability characteristics. Some are clean and transactional, some are noisy. Some fire more often than you think because autosave and metadata normalization count as updates. But if you treat every update as the business event, you build a denial of service attack against your own automation. So the first scaling law is decide what event you actually care about, then make it stable. For example, file created is usually stable. File modified is chaos unless you constrain it with conditions like status changed from draft to submitted or approval status changed. Metadata transitions are your friend because they represent intent, not activity. The event is the edge of your system. If the edge is fuzzy, everything behind it becomes expensive. Next comes reasoning. Reasoning is where most flows quietly rot because makers mix decisions and actions into one blob. They check metadata, look up a user, branch 3 times, send 2 approvals, and then move content. It works until it doesn't. And then nobody can tell whether the failure came from bad input, bad policy, or a transient connector issue. Reasoning should be treated like a policy evaluation step. Interpret metadata, validate required fields, map the item to a classification, decide routing, and decide whether the action is allowed. This can be simple rules like if department equals finance, route to finance approvers, or more advanced checks like if label is confidential, block external share requests. If you're using agents, this is also where you cage them. The agent can suggest, but the reasoning layer decides. Here's the weird part. Reasoning doesn't have to run where execution runs. Reasoning can run in a controlled service with a versioned rule set. It can run in a function. It can even run in a flow. But it has to be separable. You want to be able to test it, change it, and audit it without rewriting the whole workflow. In other words, separate decision from execution. And then comes orchestration. Orchestration is not run these steps. And orchestration is coordinate work that might fail, might take time, and might run more than once. At enterprise volume, every workflow becomes distributed systems work, whether you admit it or not. You need fan-out because one event can trigger multiple downstream actions. Notify teams, update a list, set a label, create a task, call an API. You need async because long-running approvals and content conversions don't fit neatly into a single synchronous run. You need queues because SharePoint and Graph will throttle you, and Power Automate will hit concurrency reality. You need retries because transient failures are not bugs, they're physics. And you need idempotency because duplicates will happen. Users re-upload, events refire, flows get retried, subscriptions get revalidated. Idempotency is the difference between we retried and we duplicated the project site and nobody noticed until billing. So, orchestration at scale looks like this. Receive the event, stamp it with an idempotency key, in-queue work, process it with workers that can retry safely, and record state transitions somewhere that isn't someone's memory. Power Automate can do some of that. Logic apps and functions do it more predictably. Either way, the architecture has to acknowledge that the happy path is not the common path. Finally, enforcement. Enforcement is where governance stops being a PDF and becomes runtime behavior. Set or validate permissions, apply sensitivity labels, enforce retention, evaluate DLP, log actions, and emit audit evidence. This is where you close the loop between we decided and the system did. Enforcement also means writing back to SharePoint in a way that keeps the item as the source of truth. Update metadata to reflect the outcome, store the approval state with the document, record who approved, and ensure the label and sharing posture match the policy. If your enforcement happens only in email or Teams notifications, you've built theater. Auditors don't accept theater, so the scalable model is deterministic. Event triggers. Reasoning decides, orchestration coordinates, enforcement makes it real, and if any one of those is missing, you don't get a slightly weaker automation. You get drift. And drift always wins until you design the system so it can't. Tooling decision matrix, what to standardize, what to forbid. Now you pick tools, and this is where most enterprises sabotage themselves because they turn a platform decision into a personal preference contest. What do you like more, Power Automate or Logic apps? Is the wrong question. The right question is what class of work is this and what failure modes are acceptable? Because every automation tool is a bundle of trade-offs. Throughput, latency, auditability, deployment control, and who's allowed to touch it. Start with Power Automate Cloud Flows. Power Automate is the default for business automation because it's close to the user and rich in connectors. It's also where simple becomes fragile the moment you cross from a team's workload into an enterprise workload. Concurrency limits, connector throttling, long-running approval behavior, and run history retention realities don't show up in the demo. They show up when you have 10,000 items and a Monday morning spike. So the standardization rule is strict. Use Power Automate for human-centric workflows with bounded volume and clear ownership. Notifications, approvals, basic metadata updates, small fan-out, anything that benefits from being maintained by a maker community under governance. And the forbid list is equally strict. Don't use Power Automate as the backbone for high-volume event processing, bulk content transformations, or anything that must run like a service with predictable throughput. Also, forbid personal flows as production dependencies. A workflow that matters can't be owned by whoever built it first. Next, webhooks plus Microsoft Graph. This is the event-driven backbone when you care about scale and latency. Graph subscriptions and change notifications give you a clean, something changed signal without polling, and you can route those signals into real compute. The upside is obvious: low latency, high volume, and architecture that looks like an actual system instead of a collection of runs. The downside is also obvious: you now own code, hosting, authentication, and lifecycle. Which is fine, enterprises already own code, they just pretend they don't when they call it low code. So the standard here is use webhooks and graph when the event rate is high, when seconds matter, or when you need central control over triggering behavior. And forbid the anti-pattern where each department builds their own graph listener, one listener per class of event, one pipeline, central ownership. Otherwise, you're back to sprawl, just with prettier engineering. Then, as your functions versus logic apps, this is the compute first versus workflow first divide. Functions are for code that needs to execute fast, scale out aggressively, and be tested like software. Logic apps are for orchestration that needs connectors, durable state, built-in retries, and operational visibility with less custom plumbing. In enterprise terms, functions are the sharp tool. Logic apps are the safer tool. Use functions for custom provisioning logic, transformations, complex validation, and anything where you want versioned code, unit tests, and predictable performance. Use logic apps when you need durable orchestration across systems. Queues, retries, exception handling, long-running processes, and integrations that benefit from a designed workflow graph. And here's what you forbid. Don't let functions versus logic apps become a religion. Standardize by workload. If you need a durable workflow with multiple systems, logic apps is the default. If you need custom compute that's not a workflow, functions is the default. Mixing them is allowed only when the architecture forces it, not because someone likes writing JSON less than writing C++. Now, Copilot Studio and agents. Agents are the conversational entry points. They are not the execution substrate. They're great at intake, triage, summarization, and guided actions. They can trigger workflows. They can help users find the right process. They can even generate drafts. But they cannot be your compliance pipeline because probabilistic reasoning can't be your last line of defense. So the standard is agents for interface and assistance, deterministic services for enforcement and high-throughput execution. And the forbid list is simple. Don't let agents write to authoritative systems without a governed orchestration layer and a hard permission model. Agents should request actions. Orchestration should perform actions. Enforcement should validate outcomes. Now put it all into one rule that leaders can actually enforce. One path for each class of work. Simple team automation goes through Power Automate, governed by environments and ownership rules. High-volume eventing goes through Graph and a centralized event pipeline. Cross-system and long-running orchestration goes through logic apps. Custom compute goes through functions. Agents sit on top as the intake and guidance layer. No choose your own stack, because at scale, choice is just a polite word for architectural erosion. And once that matrix is clear, you can finally talk about governance. Not as documentation, but as mechanisms that make the matrix real. Governance isn't policy docs, it's enforcement mechanisms. Most organizations think governance is a document, a site creation policy, a naming standard, a don't share PII slide deck, and a monthly meeting where everyone agrees the situation is bad. That is not governance. Governance is what remains true after a smart, busy person finds a shortcut. So the definition has to change. Governance is the set of enforcement mechanisms that survive human creativity at scale. If a control can be bypassed by convenience, it's not a control, it's a suggestion. And suggestions don't withstand SharePoint automation, because automation amplifies whatever behavior already exists. It takes the informal workaround and turns it into a repeatable button. This is the uncomfortable truth. Makers don't break governance. Systems without enforcement never had governance. So what does enforcement look like in modern SharePoint automation? It starts with control surfaces, not best practices. Actual levers that change what the platform allows. Microsoft Purview for labels, retention, and DLP. Entra for identity boundaries, guest policy, conditional access, and role separation. SharePoint admin controls for sharing defaults, site creation constraints, and lifecycle settings. Power Platform admin controls for environments, DLP across connectors, and who can create what. Each of those is a different plane of control. And if you don't connect them, you create gaps that automation happily drives through. For example, you can have a beautiful DLP policy, but if anyone can build a flow in an unmanaged environment that moves content from a labeled library to an ungoverned connector, you've built a compliance bypass with a UI. Or you can lock down external sharing at the tenant level, but if you don't control guest lifecycle and sponsorship in Entra, you just turned external collaboration into permanent external presence. Or you can define retention, but if nobody enforces labels at creation time, you've outsourced compliance to user attention span. Then comes the drift model, because drift is not a risk. Drift is the default operating mode. Every exception you approve becomes an entropy generator. This site needs external sharing. That flow needs a premium connector. This library needs unique permissions. This department needs a custom approval path. Each one sounds reasonable. Over time, they accumulate into a system nobody can reason about. Missing policies create obvious gaps. Drifting policies create ambiguity. Ambiguity creates incident time. So the governance job is not to eliminate exceptions. It's to make exceptions expensive, visible, time-bound, and reviewable. That means time-limited access, expiring sharing links, scheduled access reviews, environment-based restrictions, mandatory ownership metadata, automated lifecycle policies, telemetry that proves what changed, when, and under which identity. That last part matters. Identity is the enforcement perimeter, but telemetry is the governance perimeter. Because if you can't see sprawl, you can't manage it. So governance needs KPIs that measure entropy, not vanity. The KPI view is brutal and simple. Sprawl rate, how fast sites, teams, and flows appear compared to the organization's ability to govern them. Permission drift, how often inheritance breaks, direct assignments appear, or guests accumulate without a sponsor. DLP incidents, not just counts, but where they concentrate and which labels or locations correlate. Automation failure rate, retries, timeouts, runs that fail silently, and workflows with no owner who receives failure alerts. Those are the signals that tell you whether the control plane is working or whether you're running a distributed accident. Now notice what's missing. Number of policies, number of pages in the governance guide, number of training sessions. Those measure activity, not enforcement. So the practical architecture principle here is governance must be deployable and testable, like any other system. Controls need versioning, exceptions need lifecycle, environments need boundaries, and workflows need operational ownership. This is also why governance committees fail when they try to approve everything. They become a human bottleneck for machine speed change. The system learns to route around them because business pressure doesn't stop. So governance has to move from approval of everything to standardization of the paths. And the only way that works is start with identity, because identity is where automation gets its permissions, where agents inherit access, where service principals do the writing, and where guests become either controlled collaborators or an ongoing liability. If you get identity wrong, every other governance layer becomes cleanup. So the next section goes where most organizations avoid going until after their first major incident. Entra First Design, the group model that prevents permission fanfiction. Entra First Design, the group model that prevents permission fanfiction. Entra First Design is not identity hygiene. It's the only way SharePoint automation stays governable once it spreads beyond one team. The core law is simple. Every permission that isn't expressed as a group becomes a story someone tells themselves later. It's fine, I just added Sarah directly. It's fine, I just broke inheritance on this folder. It's fine, it's only a guest. Those decisions don't stay small. Automation reads them as truth and amplifies them. So the scaling model is group-first access. No direct user assignment, as a rule, not a preference. Owners and members map to Entra groups. Special roles map to separate groups. Exceptions map to time-bound groups. That's it, because a SharePoint permission set is not a security model. It's an implementation detail of an authorization graph. Entra is where you define the graph. SharePoint is where you attach it to content. Here's what most people miss. Automation identities need the same discipline as human identities. If a flow runs as the owner because it was built by an enthusiastic site owner 6 months ago, then the organization has created a ghost admin that never rotates, never goes on leave, and never gets reviewed. The workflow becomes a permanent privilege escalation path disguised as productivity. So you formalize automation identities. Service principals and managed identities are first-class citizens. They get explicit scopes, they get named ownership, they get lifecycle. They don't inherit random permissions because someone clicked use my connection. And they do not sit in the same groups as humans. Mixing human access and automation access is how incident reports get written. Now add role separation. SharePoint admins, Power Platform admins, and automation builders are not interchangeable just because one person can technically do all three. In Entra terms, you use role separation and privilege identity management, so that privileged access is, just in time, time-limited, and auditable. Permanent privilege is not an operational convenience. It is security debt. PIM is how you keep admin rights from becoming the default state, and it matters more with automation because the people who can create automations often become the people who can bypass controls. If the builder can also grant themselves access, you don't have governance, you have self-service escalation. Now the group model itself, a practical pattern that doesn't collapse under pressure, looks like this. One group for owners, one group for members, one group for visitors, and then additional groups for specific entitlements that are independent of site membership. Approvers should be a group. External collaborators should be a group. Workflow runners should be a group. And if a library has a unique permission boundary, that boundary is expressed as separate groups, not a list of named people. This is how you prevent permission fanfiction. Permissions stop being bespoke narratives and become reusable components. It also makes lifecycle possible. You can run access reviews on groups. You can expire group membership. You can enforce naming conventions and ownership requirements. You can detect orphaned groups. None of that works when the permission model lives as direct assignments scattered across 10,000 sites. Then comes guests. External collaboration is not a toggle in SharePoint. It's an identity lifecycle problem in Entra. Guests must have sponsorship. Guests must have expiration or review. Guests must be subject to conditional access and MFA expectations. And the invitation flow must be consistent, because anyone can invite anyone is how you end up with external identities nobody can explain. This is also where cross-tenant collaboration gets dangerous if the org treats it casually. If the enterprise allows multiple invitation patterns, multiple tenant relationships, and inconsistent guest policies, the system doesn't become flexible, it becomes untraceable. So the Entra-first blueprint is strict. Define collaboration zones and map them to guest policies. If a site is external by design, its access model is external by design. If it isn't, guests don't appear there because it was urgent. Now connect identity back to automation. When quick steps can execute a flow, the question becomes which identity does that flow run as, and what can it touch? When approvals change state inside a library, who is allowed to submit, who is allowed to approve, and what downstream rights occur on approval? When agents retrieve content, what do they inherit and what do they trigger? Entra answers those questions with one mechanism: explicit assignment via groups and roles, not ambient privilege. And once identity is stable, the next layer finally works. Labels and DLP stop being aspirational because the system can reliably tell who is acting, what they're allowed to do, and what should be blocked. That's where Purview stops being compliance tooling and becomes runtime enforcement for automation and AI readiness. Purview Foundation, label-first governance for automation and AI readiness. Purview is where most organizations learn a painful lesson. Classification isn't a compliance project. It's an architecture dependency, because once automation exists, the system needs a reliable way to answer one question on every action. What kind of data is this and what rules apply to it? If you can't answer that deterministically, you're back to humans making policy decisions in the middle of machine speed workflows. That doesn't scale. It never did. So label-first governance is the foundation. Not because labels are trendy, because labels are the only control primitive that can follow content across SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, and the downstream systems your flows and agents touch. Start with sensitivity labels. Most people treat them like classification stickers: public, internal, confidential. That's the marketing version. Architecturally, a sensitivity label is an enforcement package. It can carry encryption behaviors, access expectations, and downstream restrictions that stay attached to the file. It's a way to turn "we don't want this shared externally" into a setting the platform can actually enforce when someone tries to share it, download it, sync it, or route it through automation. And the key point for automation is simple. If labels exist only as optional user selections, they won't exist where you need them. Users won't label consistently. Makers won't label at all unless forced. And agents will happily reason over whatever you gave them, which often means the mess. So the blueprint is, labels must be part of the content lifecycle, not an afterthought. Then retention labels. Retention gets misunderstood even faster because people want it to be deletion scheduling. That's not the architectural function. Retention is about immutable outcomes and audit defensibility. This content must be kept for X years, disposed after Y, preserved under legal hold, and proven to have followed policy. The important thing is that retention doesn't care whether your workflow was smart. It cares whether the organization can produce evidence, which means your automation must not circumvent retention by moving content into locations outside the policy scope, exporting it into ungoverned storage, or generating duplicates that create legal ambiguity. Retention is where your workflow architecture meets legal reality. Now, auto-labeling. Auto-labeling sounds like salvation. Let the models find sensitive content, apply the right label, and move on. And yes, Purview can do a lot here through sensitive information types and trainable classifiers. But this is where enterprises confuse automation capability with automation authority. Auto-labeling works when the document patterns are consistent and the information architecture isn't chaos. If the organization stores contracts, invoices, and HR documents with predictable structure and consistent metadata, models can help. If the organization stores everything as final v7 docs in a library called shared, auto-labeling becomes probabilistic theater. The rule stays strict, models assist, humans own exceptions. Auto-labeling reduces toil, it does not eliminate accountability. Now connect this to AI readiness because that's why this section exists. Copilot and agents don't invent permissions, they inherit them. But what they do amplify is discoverability. If sensitive content is overshared, agents will surface it faster. If metadata is sloppy, agents will answer with the wrong latest document. If labels are missing, DLP and sharing controls can't reliably gate action. So AI readiness is not turn on Copilot. AI readiness is, can the system reliably distinguish what is safe to summarize, safe to share, safe to route, and safe to ground answers on? Labels are how you teach the platform that distinction without hoping users remember. This is also why information architecture suddenly matters again. SharePoint has always needed content types, metadata, and clear library design. The difference now is that AI fails loudly on chaos. Search could limp along with poor metadata. Agents can't. They will confidently synthesize nonsense from a messy corpus, and your users will treat it as authoritative because it speaks fluently. So you standardize the minimum viable information architecture, required metadata for high-value libraries, consistent naming for sites and libraries, and a label taxonomy that maps to real enforcement. Not 20 labels nobody understands, a small number that represent real policy boundaries. And you wire those labels into automation pathways. Workflows should set labels when business context is known, not wait for users. Provisioning should apply default labels to sites and libraries based on purpose. Approval completion should trigger label validation before content moves to an externally shareable zone. Agents should operate in spaces where labeling discipline exists because otherwise they become a high-speed interface to your ungoverned past. Here's what most people miss. Label first is not about making compliance happy. It's about giving your automation a deterministic control surface. When a flow runs, it should be able to check a label and know what to do. When a quick step executes, it should run into the same label-based boundary every time. When an agent suggests an action, the enforcement layer should be able to say yes or no based on label-driven policy, not on vibes. That's the foundation. And once labels are real, DLP becomes something else entirely, not a compliance report. A runtime gate. DLP as a runtime gate. Stop leakage, log intent, allow business. DLP is where the enterprise stops pretending it can train its way out of data leakage. Most organizations deploy DLP like a museum alarm. It exists, it's loud, and everyone learns how to walk around it. The modern blueprint treats DLP as a runtime gate, a control that evaluates the moment of action, blocks the bad paths, and records the intent when you allow an exception. That distinction matters because automation changes the leakage shape. Without automation, leakage usually happens through a person. Copy to USB, forward an email, share a link. With automation, leakage happens through a workflow identity. Move this file, email this PDF, sync this data that posted to that connector, and because it's machine speed, the volume can spike before anyone notices. So the DLP job isn't to be perfect, it's to be present at the exact moment your workflows move data across a boundary. The enterprise requirement is unified DLP, one policy language, many surfaces. SharePoint libraries, Teams files, OneDrive, endpoints, and the connectors your flows use all represent different exfiltration paths. If DLP only exists in one of those layers, you've built a control that blocks the honest user and misses the real root. Purview's value is that the same classification concepts, sensitive info types, labels, locations, can be expressed as a single enforcement strategy instead of 5 separate rulebooks maintained by 5 different teams. And then you stratify. This is where most DLP programs fail. They create one policy that tries to protect everything, and it ends up either blocking the business or blocking nothing. The blueprint is explicit policy stratification, separate blast radii for separate data classes. PII is one blast radius, financial data is another, source code is another, M&A documents are another, HR investigations are another. Why? Because what counts as acceptable friction is different for each class. An engineer moving code to a repo is not the same as a recruiter sharing candidate data. If you treat them the same, you either destroy productivity or normalize bypasses. Now, the runtime part. A good DLP gate doesn't just block. It offers controlled outcomes, allow, block, or allow with justification. And allow with justification is not a feel-good compromise, it's a telemetry generator. If someone needs to share something sensitive for a legitimate reason, the system can allow it, but only if the user supplies a reason, and only if that event is logged as a high-signal audit trail. That creates 2 things you never get from blanket blocking: accountability and a tuning loop. Because false positives are not a bug. They're a feature of pattern-based detection meeting messy enterprise data. So you design an escalation path and a tuning loop on purpose. When the system blocks a legitimate business action, there must be a known place to go. A request path, a review queue, a policy exception process that is time-bound and tied to an owner. And when the system allows something with justification, that justification data becomes input into policy refinement. Over time, the policy stops being theoretical and starts reflecting how the business actually moves data. Here's the part automation teams miss. DLP has to understand your automation identities. If a flow runs under a service principal or managed identity, the DLP posture needs to account for it. Otherwise, you end up with the worst outcome. Humans blocked, automations free. That is how we lock down sharing turns into the workflow emailed the file externally anyway. So the blueprint requires this. Every automation pathway that exports, shares, or transforms content gets treated as a data egress point. It's evaluated, it's logged, and it has an owner who can explain why it exists. Now connect DLP back to quick steps and approvals. Quick steps reduce friction, which means they increase usage, which means they increase risk surface. If execute flow is available on sensitive libraries, then DLP and labeling must sit behind it as a non-negotiable gate. Approvals create state, but they don't enforce classification. So the enforcement must happen at the moment of sharing, moving, exporting, or posting to other systems, especially when the action is triggered by approved status and nobody is watching the downstream step. So the DLP design goal is brutally simple. Stop leakage, log intent, allow business. And if you do it right, DLP becomes less about security theater and more about engineering reality, a runtime decision engine that reduces blast radius while producing evidence. Now, none of this matters if you can't see what the system is doing. A runtime gate without observability is just silent failure with better branding. Observability architecture, audit logs, diagnostics, sentinel, and real signals. If governance is enforcement, observability is proof. And enterprises don't fail because they lacked policies. They fail because they couldn't prove what happened when automation did something weird at 2:13 a.m. Observability is how a workflow platform stays a platform instead of becoming a haunted house of "it usually works." Start with the unified audit log because it's the thing everyone vaguely knows exists and almost nobody designs around. The audit log is good at answering who did what to which object and when. File accessed, file shared, permission changed, sensitivity label applied, guest invited. That's the compliance-grade trail. It's the ledger you pull when legal asks or when an incident responder needs attribution. But it's not operational telemetry. It won't tell you why your flow ran 5 times. It won't show you latency distributions. It won't give you an execution graph. And it definitely won't explain failure modes inside Power Automate, Azure Functions, or Logic apps. So treat the audit log as the what happened source, not the how is it behaving source. That distinction matters. Next, diagnostic logs, SharePoint, Entra, and the automation runtime all generate diagnostics that are closer to engineering reality. Requests, throttles, API responses, connector errors, job durations, queue depth, retry counts. These belong in log analytics because you want one place where you can correlate identity signals, SharePoint activity, and workflow execution. This is where most orgs quietly lose. They log in each silo. Power Automate run history sits in one place, function logs sit in another, SharePoint activity sits somewhere else. Sentinel has alerts but not context. And then during an incident, someone screenshots 5 portals and calls it root cause analysis. But that's not analysis, that's archaeology. So the observability architecture is explicit: centralize telemetry, normalize correlation, and make queries repeatable. A practical pattern is to stamp everything with correlation identifiers you can carry across the system. Event ID, site ID, item ID, flow run ID, function invocation ID, user ID, service principal ID. If you can't join the data, you can't reason about the system. And if you can't reason about it, you can't scale it. Now, Sentinel. Sentinel is not the place you dump logs and hope intelligence happens. Sentinel is where you codify detections that matter for SharePoint automation. Oversharing patterns, abnormal access, and automation identities doing suspicious things. Start with oversharing detections. New anonymous links created on a library that should never allow them. A spike in shared with external users events, a folder with broken inheritance that suddenly starts receiving labeled content. Those are high signal events because they represent boundary failure, not just activity. Then abnormal access patterns, a guest account downloading hundreds of files, a user accessing a site they never touched before right after an invitation, a service principal reading across many sites outside its normal scope. Those aren't maybe incidents. They're the kinds of patterns that, if you ignore them, become breach narratives. And now, the part most orgs skip, automation failure signals. A flow failing is not an IT problem, it's a business process outage, so your detections need to include sustained failure rates above a threshold, dead letter growth, retries exceeding normal, queue age exceeding SLA, and flows with no owners receiving failure notifications. Failure without alerting is just deferred surprise. That leads to the brutal question, what metrics actually matter? Most dashboards are vanity. The real signals are latency, throughput, failure rate, and drift. Latency. How long from event to enforcement? Not run duration, end-to-end time. If an approval takes 2 days, fine. But if label applied after upload takes 30 minutes, you've just created an exposure window. Throughput. Events processed per unit time and how that changes during predictable spikes. Month end, Monday morning, quarter close. The system must survive reality, not average load. Failure rate, not did it fail once. Failure distribution by connector, by site, by label, by identity, by workflow version. This is how you find systemic brittleness. Drift trend lines. Permissions inheritance breaks over time, guest count per site, number of flows per site, number of quick-step invocation points, number of exceptions. Drift is your entropy meter. And here's the governance outcome. Observability isn't optional because you like monitoring. It's required because automation without observability is blind execution, and blind execution eventually hits the one library that contained the one document that triggers the one audit. So once you've built the control plane, identity labels, DLP, and telemetry, you can finally talk about scale scenarios without lying to yourself. And the first one is the most common enterprise fantasy, provisioning. Scenario 1, framing. Provisioning is a factory line, not a request form. Provisioning is where SharePoint automation stops being a convenience feature and becomes an enterprise liability generator. Because every organization starts the same way. Someone creates a site for a project, then another. Then another. Someone uses a template. Someone doesn't. Someone adds owners directly. Someone breaks inheritance on a folder because finance needs privacy. Guests get invited because it's urgent. A year later, nobody remembers why half of these sites exist, who owns them, or which ones contain regulated content. That isn't user failure. That's a missing factory. Most enterprises treat provisioning like a request form problem. Let's make a form, ask a few questions, and route it for approval. They get the form. They even get the approval. What they never build is the assembly line behind it. Deterministic creation, deterministic configuration, deterministic access model, and deterministic lifecycle. So the framing is strict. Provisioning is manufacturing. A request is just demand signal. The product is a workspace with known properties. And if you don't build it like manufacturing, you don't get some inconsistency. You get an uncontrolled estate. Thousands of workspaces that behave differently, leak differently, and fail audits differently. The factory line model starts with a few non-negotiables. First, every site is created from a template. Not usually, always. The template isn't only branding, it's baseline controls. Default sharing posture, default sensitivity label expectations, default library structure, default navigation, default owners and members mapping, default retention configuration where applicable, and the metadata standards that make automation reliable later. Second, every site has accountable ownership at creation time, not a person's name typed into a text field. An Entra group as the owner with at least 2 human owners inside it and an actual lifecycle expectation. If ownership is optional, the estate becomes orphaned on day 1. Then your lifecycle policy becomes a cleanup script that no one wants to run because it will delete something important. Third, permissions come from the group model, not from creativity. The provisioning pipeline doesn't ask who should have access, it asks which access model applies. Internal project, external collaboration zone, records repository, department hub. Each one maps to a predefined set of groups and site settings. That's how you stop every new workspace from being a custom snowflake with a custom risk profile. Now, the part leaders always underestimate volume. At enterprise scale, provisioning isn't a few sites per week. It's constant background noise, new teams, new initiatives, new partners, reorganizations, acquisitions, divestitures, and compliance requirements that force new segregation. The demand doesn't slow down because governance is busy. It speeds up because the business is busy. That means the provisioning system can't be a human pipeline. It has to be event-driven and async, with predictable throughput and failure handling. Because a manual, synchronous provisioning flow doesn't just create delays, it creates bypass behavior. People will create sites directly because it's urgent and your factory gets quietly replaced by shadow manufacturing. So a scalable provisioning pattern looks like this: intake, validate, approve, provision, enforce, and register. Intake is your request portal, form, or agent-driven entry point. That's the only place you collect human intent. Validation is where you enforce naming standards, required fields, and policy eligibility. Can this user request an external collaboration site? Is this business unit allowed to create a hub site association? Does this workload require a retention label? The validation step is where you reject bad requests quickly before you create infrastructure you'll regret. Approval is not about gatekeeping creation. Approval is about allocating risk. Someone with actual authority signs off that this workspace should exist with these boundaries, and the approval must be tied to the same identity model you'll enforce later. If approvers are ad hoc, you've created a loophole with a pretty UI. Provisioning itself is pure execution. Create the site using Graph, apply the template, associate to the correct hub, create libraries and lists, apply baseline settings, create the owner-member groups, and apply permissions. No branching business logic scattered across 20 flow steps. One provisioning service, versioned, testable, and repeatable. And then the thing everyone forgets: registration. If a site exists but isn't registered in an inventory with purpose, owner group, classification expectations, and lifecycle policy, it's invisible. Invisible becomes ungovernable. Ungovernable becomes we didn't know it was there when Copilot starts surfacing it, or when an auditor asks why a partner still has access 2 years after the contract ended. Finally, lifecycle. Provisioning without lifecycle is just automated sprawl. So the factory must include inactivity thresholds, renewal prompts for ownership, enforced transfer of ownership when owners leave, archival pathways, and retirement that's policy-driven instead of emotional. The system doesn't ask humans to remember. It detects, notifies, escalates, and then enforces. That's the frame. Provisioning is a factory line, not a request form. And once you accept that, the next section gets concrete: the reference architecture that implements this factory with graph provisioning and queue-based orchestration. Scenario 1: reference architecture, graph provisioning, plus queue-based orchestration. The reference architecture is deliberately boring because boring is what survives enterprise scale. It starts with an entry point that looks like a request but behaves like a contract, a form, a portal, an agent. It doesn't matter. What matters is the payload. Purpose, data classification expectations, internal versus external, requested owners group, and any required lifecycle dates. And if the request can't express intent in a structured way, the provisioning pipeline can't enforce it later. You'll be guessing. Systems guess badly. From there, the first component is validation. Not does the form have values, policy validation, naming conventions, allowed site types, allowed hubs, allowed sharing posture. If the request asks for an external collaboration site, the validator checks whether the requester is allowed to sponsor external access, whether the tenant policy allows it, and whether the right collaboration zone exists. If the request fails validation, it stops here, cleanly, with a reason. The goal is to fail fast before anything exists. Then approval. This is the risk gate. The approver isn't someone in IT. It's the authority that owns the risk. Business owner for the workspace plus, when required, compliance or security for specific data classes. The approval object is stored as evidence. Who approved, what they approved, and what policy profile was applied. And if you can't reconstruct that later, you don't have governance, you have folklore. Now the actual provisioning path, Microsoft Graph. Graph creates the site, but the provisioning service owns the choreography. Site creation, hub association, baseline site settings, default sharing posture, feature toggles that matter, library creation, list creation, navigation, homepage. This is where teams get tempted to embed logic into a 200-step flow. Don't. The provisioning service should be one unit, versioned, testable, and repeatable. If you can't redeploy it safely, you'll end up with old sites and new sites that behave differently, and then your support team lives in a split-brain estate. Permissions are applied next, and they are not optional. Owners and members map to entra groups, nested groups where you need role separation. No direct assignments because direct assignments don't scale and they don't survive staff turnover. The provisioning service sets the groups, assigns them to the site, and writes the group IDs back into the site metadata or a central inventory, so you can later prove which group was supposed to control access. Now the part that makes this actually scale, queue-based orchestration. The intake and approval pipeline should not do the work. It should enqueue the work. A queue message includes the request ID, the target site profile, the idempotency key, and the desired state. Then workers pull from the queue and execute provisioning steps. Why? Because you need retries, you need backoff, and you need to survive graph throttling without turning provisioning into a timeout festival. Idempotency is the hard requirement. If the same request gets processed twice, the second run must detect this site already exists and converge it to the desired configuration, not create a duplicate. That means the system keeps a durable state record. Request received, approved, site created, hub joined, permissions applied, baseline configured, registration completed. If a worker dies halfway, the next worker resumes, no guesswork. Retries are engineered, not hoped for. Transient graph errors get retried with exponential backoff. Permanent errors get sent to a dead letter queue with the full context needed to replay safely. And replay isn't click run again. Replay is re-enqueue the same request with the same idempotency key and let the system converge. Finally, registration and reporting. Every provisioned site is written to an inventory, purpose, owner group, sensitivity expectations, external collaboration status, and lifecycle policy. This inventory feeds monitoring and governance. It's also how you answer the only question leaders care about during audits. How many exist? Who owns them? And are they compliant? That's the reference architecture: contract intake, policy validation, explicit approval evidence, graph-based provisioning, group-first permissions, and queue-driven orchestration with idempotency. It's not glamorous. It's operable. Scenario 1, SharePoint native layer, quick steps and integrated workflows as front ends. Now comes the part that confuses people because they think provisioning ends when the site exists. It doesn't. Provisioning ends when users can do the right thing by default. This is where SharePoint native automation features fit. Quick steps, integrated workflows, and lightweight approvals. Not as the provisioning system, but as the front ends that let humans interact with the factory without having to understand the factory. Start with quick steps. In this architecture, quick steps are not random convenience buttons created by whoever has edit rights. Quick steps are standardized invocation points. The sanctioned set of actions users can take on content that will always route into the governed automation path. That means you treat quick steps like an API surface. You decide which actions exist per site template. You decide which libraries get which quick steps. And you decide what those quick steps are allowed to trigger. Because the biggest mistake is letting every library owner invent their own buttons and accidentally create a shadow process landscape. The simple pattern is quick steps give users consistent verbs. Submit for review, request external share, move to funded, create case. Those verbs should map to explicit metadata transitions, not direct side effects. A quick step that sets status from draft to submitted is predictable. A quick step that moves files between libraries, changes permissions, and emails external recipients is not. Side effects belong in orchestration, not in UI buttons. So you design quick steps to do one job, mark intent. Then your pipeline listens for that intent and executes the controlled steps behind it. This also makes idempotency easier because status change to submitted becomes your stable event rather than user clicked the button 5 times because the UI lagged. Now integrated workflows. Microsoft is bringing a workflows UX into SharePoint that looks like Teams workflows, templates, pre-configured connections, simple edits, and a build from scratch path. For enterprise automation, the value isn't that it's easier to build. The value is that it's easier to standardize, if you treat it correctly. Integrated workflows should exist as approved templates that implement front-end patterns, notifications, reminders, lightweight routing, and simple post-approval steps that don't cross major governance boundaries. They're allowed to accelerate the last mile of team productivity because they run inside the site context and make the experience cohesive. But the system law stays intact. Anything that looks like a back-end service does not live here. Provisioning doesn't live here. Lifecycle doesn't live here. Compliance enforcement doesn't live here. High-volume event processing doesn't live here. Those belong in the central orchestration layer you already designed because you need versioning, deployment control, retries, and a single place to observe system behavior. So the enterprise rule is SharePoint native workflows are front ends, not foundations. They handle the human-facing edges, the places where people start a process, get notified, provide input, and see status. The moment the workflow needs to do something irreversible, cross-boundary, or high risk, it hands off to the central pipeline through a controlled mechanism, a queue message, a call to a function, or a standardized connector action that hits your orchestration endpoint. That handoff is the line between team automation and enterprise automation. Now, the ugly feature, execute flow inside quick steps. It's powerful because it turns any document library into a launchpad for process. It's dangerous because it turns any document library into a launchpad for process. The governance issue isn't that it can trigger a flow. The issue is that it can trigger a flow that lives outside the mental model of the site. And because it can target flows outside the default environment, you can end up with a button in a library that invokes automation in an environment your governance team doesn't associate with that site's risk profile. So the control is simple. Don't govern flows, govern invocation. Only approved quick steps can execute flows. Only approved flows can be executed from quick steps. And those approvals need to be enforced by environment strategy and ownership rules, not by please don't. This is where Power Platform governance intersects with SharePoint design. If your environment strategy is loose, quick steps become a convenient bypass. If your environment strategy is strict, quick steps become a safe accelerator. Now talk about accountability, because enterprise workflows don't fail gracefully when nobody owns them. SharePoint's workflows pane exposes things like run history and owners. That's useful, but it's not enough unless you standardize ownership as a requirement. Every workflow must have an owner group, not a person. Every workflow must emit failure signals to a monitored channel, not to someone's inbox. And every workflow must be tied to the site inventory so you can answer what automations exist here, who owns them, and what happens when they break. This is also why the SharePoint native layer should be deployed through templates, not created ad hoc. The template defines the quick steps, the allowed workflows, the approval settings, and the metadata columns that represent state. Users get a clean experience. The enterprise gets a predictable control surface. And with that, the front end and the factory finally align. People click a simple button, metadata moves to a new state. The event pipeline triggers, the orchestration executes, and enforcement applies labels, permissions, and logging. The UI stays simple, the architecture stays real. Scenario 1, lifecycle enforcement, archive, lock, transfer ownership, retire. Lifecycle enforcement is the part everyone agrees with in theory and then quietly avoids because it forces the organization to admit something uncomfortable. Workspaces are liabilities. A SharePoint site is not a place to collaborate. It's a permission boundary, a data container, and a long-term obligation. If the lifecycle is optional, your automation program doesn't scale into productivity. It scales into an estate you can't explain. So the lifecycle pattern has to be designed like enforcement, not like reminders. Start with inactivity handling because that's the cleanest signal you'll ever get. A site stops being used, files stop changing, pages stop being edited, membership stops shifting. And yes, there are edge cases. A site can be quiet and still important. That's why the system doesn't delete first. It detects, then it notifies, then it escalates, then it enforces. A scalable policy looks like this. After n days of inactivity, notify the owner group with a simple choice. Extend, archive, or retire. If they extend, they must supply a reason and an end date. That reason becomes evidence, not because auditors love text fields, but because future humans need to understand why the exception existed. If nobody responds, the system does what humans always avoid. It proceeds. Archival is not a vibe, it's a state transition. Archived means membership is locked down, editing is restricted, external sharing is disabled, and the site becomes read-only or near read-only depending on your policy. If the business needs to reopen it, they can, but reopening is an explicit action with an audit trail, not an accident caused by someone stumbling into add member. Then you implement locking, because some content should remain accessible but not mutable. Locking is the difference between we kept it and we preserved evidence. Now, if a project is over, you don't want someone to upload final documents 6 months later and rewrite history. So the policy defines when the system locks: project end date, contract termination, regulatory trigger, or a status transition like closed. The lock should be enforced by permission changes and sharing posture, not by telling users to behave. Now, ownership-orphaned sites are the default outcome of staff turnover. People change roles, leave the company, or stop caring about the project. If site ownership is tied to individuals, the system will inevitably lose its accountable humans, and your lifecycle engine becomes a dead process, emailing an empty inbox. So ownership enforcement is an identity workflow. On a schedule, the system checks whether the owner group still has active human owners. If not, it triggers a transfer policy, notify the business unit sponsor, require reassignment within a time window, and if that doesn't happen, the site moves to a restricted state. Not deleted, restricted, because unowned, mutable collaboration zones are how data leaks and governance collapses. And yes, this feels harsh. Good. Harsh is what prevents your future incident review. The next step is content hygiene, which is where people want magic and the platform provides reality. Stale pages, broken links, duplicate documents, and we have 5 versions of the same policy in 5 sites. Some of this can be detected, some of it can't. The architecture principle stays simple. Hygiene is a signal generator, not a cleanup promise. So you run periodic scans where capabilities exist, detect orphaned pages, detect broken links, detect duplicate files by hash where your tooling supports it, flag libraries with extreme item counts, and flag unlabeled content in high-risk locations. The outcome isn't the system fixes everything. The outcome is the system produces a prioritized backlog for the owner group, and it can gate future automation on unresolved hygiene when risk requires it. Now, automation failure handling, because lifecycle workflows are long-running and long-running workflows fail. At scale, a lifecycle engine needs dead letter patterns. When an archive action fails, the message goes to a dead letter queue with context, not to a buried run history. It needs retries with backoff. It needs idempotency so you don't lock and unlock repeatedly because of duplicate events. And it needs a human override path that's logged and time-bound, because someone fixed it manually is not an operational model. The retirement step is the one everyone wants to skip. Retire means content is disposed according to retention policy, the site is deleted when it is legally allowed, and the inventory record is updated so you can prove it happened. Retire is not a button, it's a governed outcome. And the whole lifecycle model has one purpose: keep your SharePoint automation estate converging toward policy over time instead of drifting away from it. Because automation doesn't create order, enforcement does. Scenario 2 framing. Compliance isn't a project, it's continuous evidence. Compliance is where we'll clean it up later goes to die. Because leaders keep treating compliance like a project: hire someone, write a policy, run a migration, do an audit, celebrate, and move on. That model works only if content stops changing. SharePoint does not stop changing. Automation makes it change faster. AI makes it change in more places at once. So compliance can't be an initiative. It has to be a continuous evidence system. That distinction matters because regulators don't ask whether you had good intentions. They ask whether you can prove outcomes. Retention happened, holds were honored, access was controlled, and you can reconstruct who did what, to which record, under which authority, at which time. And prove means evidence you can generate on demand. Not a spreadsheet someone updated manually, not a screenshot from a portal, not a story that begins with, "Normally, our process is." The compliance reality is this: once automation exists, the blast radius of a failure becomes a legal event. If a workflow misroutes a document under hold, or a label gets skipped, or a library becomes overshared and an agent surfaces it, the impact isn't only technical, it's defensibility. So scenario 2 is built around one idea: compliance is continuous because the system never stops producing new content, new copies, new links, and new access paths. Start with the regulatory requirements you actually face. Retention and disposal: what must be kept, for how long, and what must be deleted when allowed. Legal hold: what must be preserved immediately and indefinitely when a case triggers it. Immutability: where records must not be altered even by administrators. Audit trail: the ability to show a chain of custody for content and decisions. Those aren't features, they're system properties. And this is where organizations make the foundational mistake. They try to bolt these properties onto a chaotic estate. They treat records management as a set of labels you apply after the fact. But at scale, retroactive compliance is fantasy. It always becomes a backlog that never ends because the platform produces content faster than you can classify it. So the framing has to flip. Compliance begins at creation, not at audit time. That leads directly into the records model because compliance isn't just keep everything. You have to define what becomes a record, when it becomes a record, and who has the authority to declare it. A draft contract in negotiation is not the same as an executed contract. A policy page in progress is not the same as an approved policy. A project document under review is not the same as the final deliverable that drives a regulated decision. If you don't encode that difference into the system, you end up retaining everything forever because nobody trusts disposal. Then storage explodes, discovery becomes impossible, and audits become painful. So the records model has to be expressed as deterministic state transitions. Approved becomes record. Published becomes record. Case opened applies hold. That's the only model that scales because it ties compliance to workflow outcomes the platform can observe. Now, here's the part people try to negotiate. Label first. They want to treat labeling as optional because it slows users down. But in compliance workloads, label first is not optional. It's the only scalable classifier under pressure. Without labels, retention policies can't target correctly, DLP can't reason consistently, and audit evidence becomes ambiguous. And ambiguity is what gets organizations hurt in audits. So the compliance blueprint forces label assignment into the system. Templates apply default sensitivity expectations. Workflows validate labeling before moving content across boundaries. Approval completion triggers retention outcomes where required, and exceptions are not allowed silently. If something can't be labeled, it goes into an exception lane with an owner and a timer. That's what leaders need to understand. You don't get compliance by asking people to care. You get compliance by making the compliant path the path of least resistance. Now layer in the continuous evidence part. Continuous evidence means the system continuously emits proof artifacts, label applied events, retention policy evaluation, sharing decisions, access changes, and workflow actions that affect record state. It also means the organization can answer hard questions quickly. Show all records in this category, show all items under hold, show all external shares for labeled content, show all workflows that moved content out of a retention scoped location. If that query requires 5 teams in 2 weeks, you don't have evidence, you have organizational memory. And organizational memory fails exactly when you need it most. So scenario 2 isn't how to do retention. It's how to design an enterprise compliance plane that stays true as automation accelerates change. Deterministic records state, label-first classification, enforced holds, and evidence you can stream into monitoring and investigations. And once that framing is clear, the next section becomes straightforward. The actual architecture, purview for retention and labels, DLP as runtime enforcement, and audit streaming for defensibility. Scenario 2, architecture, retention, legal hold, and audit defensibility by design. So the architecture for compliance has to do 3 things at once. Enforce retention outcomes, freeze content instantly when legal says so, and generate evidence without begging humans for screenshots. Start with purview, retention labels, and retention policies, because that's where you declare the immutable truth, what gets kept, for how long, and what happens at the end. Labels are the per-item truth. Policies are the where does this truth apply. And in enterprise terms, the only design that survives scale is scope intentionally, publish intentionally, improve intentionally. Scope means you don't spray retention across the tenant and hope it works. You define locations and categories that map to business purpose, a contracts library, an HR case site, a finance records center, a regulated project hub. Then you publish the label or policy into those places so the system can defend the claim, content of this type, in this location, follows this rule. And yes, that means you need fewer, clearer locations, because retention can't fix architecture. It can only enforce what you designed. Now, legal hold. Legal hold is where automation usually embarrasses people because the business thinks hold is a label and IT thinks hold is an e-discovery case, and nobody designs the state transition in between. Architecturally, a hold is a freeze order that must override every convenience feature. Deletion, overwrites, cleanup scripts, lifecycle retirement, and we'll just move the files. So the blueprint is, holds are triggered centrally, applied automatically, and treated as higher priority than every lifecycle mechanism. If a site is under hold, the lifecycle engine can still archive it, but it cannot dispose it. If a record is under hold, a workflow can still route it, but it cannot transform it into a new untracked copy without logging and policy review. Holds don't stop work, they stop irreversible outcomes. That distinction matters. Now, sensitivity labels. Sensitivity is the access expectation layer, and for compliance, it's the difference between we retained it and we retained it safely. If the organization retains regulated data but allows broad sharing, then retention just preserves the evidence of failure longer. So you use sensitivity labels to carry enforcement behaviors that align with your compliance model, encryption where required, restrictions on external sharing where required, and consistent user experience signals so people don't accidentally treat sensitive content as general collaboration content. And this is where the platform's behavior becomes uncomfortable. Labels need to be applied early because retroactive labeling after exposure is just an audit artifact, not protection. So your architecture wires labeling into creation and into state transitions. New site created with a compliance profile gets a default sensitivity expectation. Content declared as a record gets a label validation step. Content moved into a records library gets labeling enforced as part of the move, not after it lands. Then DLP. In this scenario, DLP is the runtime enforcement that stops the most common compliance violation, exporting regulated content into a path that retention and hold controls can't see. That includes email attachments, unmanaged connectors, external shares, and temporary copies to personal locations. DLP doesn't replace retention, it protects retention scope boundaries. So you design DLP to align with your retention locations and your sensitivity labels. If content carries a regulated label, DLP blocks the obvious exfiltration paths, and where the business must proceed, DLP allows with justification and logs the event as a compliance signal. Now audit defensibility. This is the part everyone says they want, but almost nobody implements beyond default logging. Defensibility requires correlation, a retention decision, a hold application, a label change, a sharing event, and a workflow action all need to be explainable as one narrative. So you stream audit logs into a place where investigations can actually happen at speed. Microsoft's unified audit log gives you the compliance trail, but you need correlation and detection, which means connecting audit signals to Sentinel or another SIEM workflow where you can build queries and alerts that answer real questions, show all external shares of content with this sensitivity label, show all attempts to delete content under hold, show all automation identities that modified records libraries, show all sites where retention policies were removed or changed. And because compliance is continuous evidence, you don't only investigate incidents, you generate proof packs on a schedule. For leadership, that means the architecture includes reporting by design, retention coverage by location, hold coverage by case, oversharing for regulated labels, and workflow pathways that touch regulated content. If those reports require a one-time project to assemble, they won't exist when the auditor asks. So the compliance architecture is not turn-on retention. It is scoped retention enforcement, centralized hold priority, label-driven access expectations, DLP as boundary protection, and audit streaming that produces defensible narratives without heroics. Scenario 2, workflows. Lightweight approvals versus custom flows versus backend orchestration. Now the workflows question, because this is where compliance programs quietly sabotage themselves. They take a regulated process, then they scatter its logic across whatever automation primitive was easiest for the last person who touched it. A lightweight approval here, a personal flow there, a temporary branching workflow in someone's environment. Then they call it covered. It isn't compliance workflows need one property above all others. The decision path must be reconstructible later, not just approved or rejected, but who approved, in what order, under what policy, with what evidence attached, and what happened after the approval. If you can't replay the logic, you can't defend the outcome. So pick the primitive based on what must be provable, not what is fastest to build. Start with lightweight approvals in SharePoint lists and libraries. They are useful specifically because they keep state close to the content. The approval status becomes metadata. The experience stays in the grid. You can define default approvers, and you can stage and sequence them. That's a clean pattern for simple gates. This document must be approved before it becomes visible, or this item must be reviewed before it gets published. And the hidden advantage is governance. When the approval state is stored on the item, it's harder to lose the trail. You're not hunting across flow run histories and emails to figure out what happened. But lightweight approvals have a hard boundary. They are not a compliance workflow engine. They don't model complex branching, conditional attestations, dynamic evidence collection, or multipath escalation. They also don't replace your need for centralized monitoring. They're a front-end gate that works when the policy is simple and the blast radius is contained. Now, custom Power Automate approvals. This is where people go when they need real workflow behavior. Branching based on metadata, parallel versus sequential approvers, conditional routing, reminders, SLAs, exception handling, and recorded justifications. And yes, Power Automate can do it. The problem is scale and lifecycle. A Power Automate approval flow is a software artifact. It needs versioning. It needs a deployment model. It needs ownership that survives turnover. And it needs to be designed so that an approver can't be bypassed by someone cloning a flow and tweaking one condition. The uncomfortable truth is that Power Automate makes it easy to create production logic without production discipline. That's why compliance teams end up with approval sprawl. Dozens of nearly identical flows, each slightly different, each with its own connector assumptions, each with its own failure mode. So the rule is strict. If you use custom flows for compliance, you standardize them as managed assets. Solutions, environments, naming, owners, and run visibility. No personal flows, no I'll just fix it in my account. That's not automation, that's delegated risk. Now, backend orchestration, logic apps or Azure functions. This is for when the workflow is either high volume, high complexity, or high consequence. High volume means you can't tolerate per-run UX throttles and fragile connector behavior. High complexity means you're transforming content, calling multiple systems using queues, and you need deterministic retrieves and idempotency. High consequence means a mistake creates legal exposure. Records declaration, hold enforcement, regulated exports, or irreversible state changes. In those cases, the workflow belongs in an orchestration layer that behaves like software. Source control, deployment pipelines, unit tests where possible, structured logging, and a clear separation between decision and execution. This is where the approval becomes a service boundary. The approval interaction can still happen in SharePoint or Teams because humans need a place to click buttons, but the system that interprets that approval and performs downstream actions lives in the back end, where you can actually control it. And here's the anti-pattern to call out clearly: approval logic scattered across personal flows. That design fails three ways at scale. First, it destroys audit defensibility because you can't prove which version ran and why. Second, it breaks continuity because the flow dies when the owner leaves or changes their password or loses a license. Third, it creates inconsistent enforcement because two teams will implement the same policy differently and both will swear they're compliant. They aren't. So the decision matrix is simple. If you need a lightweight gate and the state should live on the item, use lightweight approvals. If you need richer branching but the process stays inside the team boundary, use Power Automate approvals, but only as a governed managed asset. If the workflow crosses systems, crosses tenants, touches regulated data at scale, or must survive organizational entropy, move it to back-end orchestration and treat approvals as inputs, not as the engine. And that sets up the next scenario, because external collaboration is where approvals stop being workflow questions and become boundary questions. Scenario 3 framing. External sharing is a controlled zone, not a per-site preference. External sharing is where SharePoint stops being collaboration and becomes a boundary negotiation with your legal team. And the foundational mistake is predictable. Organizations treat external sharing as a per-site preference, a toggle, a convenience setting the site owner can adjust when the partner relationship feels urgent. That model is not governance, it's delegated risk with a ribbon on it. Because once you allow external sharing as a local preference, you don't get one external sharing posture. You get hundreds, each one with different link types, different expiration behaviors, different guest controls, and different expectations about what safe means. Then the business asks for Copilot, and suddenly your partner site is no longer a quiet place to upload documents. It's an AI-grounded knowledge surface that can summarize, search, and surface content at machine speed. So the framing for scenario 3 is strict. External sharing is a controlled zone. A zone is not a site template. A zone is a policy boundary with dedicated defaults, dedicated monitoring, and dedicated lifecycle rules. It exists because external collaboration is not a feature request. It's a threat model. Start with the problem reality. Partner workspaces happen constantly. Vendors, joint ventures, auditors, contractors, client delivery teams. And even if IT blocks external sharing broadly, users will still share externally. They'll email attachments, use personal storage, or spin up shadow tools. So no external sharing is not a strategy. It's denial. The strategy is provide an approved path that is safer than the bypass. That path is the external collaboration zone. It's a dedicated site or hub structure where every site inherits hardened defaults. No anonymous links, required authentication, enforced expiration, restricted download where needed, and labels that reflect the data types allowed in that zone. If the business needs to collaborate with partners, they do it here, not in random internal project sites, not in HR team sites, not in someone's personal OneDrive. This is also where you stop pretending that site owner education scales. Owners change, they get busy, they forget, they inherit sites they didn't create. And they will make exceptions under pressure because the partner relationship matters more than your policy document. So the zone has to survive convenience pressure by design. Policy is inherited and enforced, not configured repeatedly. Now, the uncomfortable truth about external sharing, it's not just about guests, it's about links. Most leakage happens through links that outlive intent. Links created for a short-term partner, links forwarded to the wrong person, links never revoked, links that keep working after the contract ends because nobody remembered they existed. So the zone model treats link creation as an auditable action with lifecycle. Expiration is the default, not the exception. High-risk labels require shorter expiration, and if the business needs no expiration, that's an exception with explicit owner approval and ongoing review. Then guest lifecycle. Guests aren't users, they're temporary risk allocations. So every guest needs sponsorship, and that sponsorship has to be enforceable. If a guest loses their sponsor, they don't remain in the tenant as a ghost identity with access nobody can explain. They get reviewed, then removed. If a partner project ends, guests get deprovisioned automatically, not when someone remembers. That means external collaboration zones need lifecycle hooks, start date, end date, renewal prompts, and a clean teardown path. Otherwise, your tenant becomes a museum of expired partnerships with valid access. Now add GDPR and data sovereignty pressure, because this is where regulators stop accepting "we didn't mean to." If PII enters an external zone, you need deterministic controls that prevent it from spreading, sensitivity labels that restrict sharing behavior, DLP rules that block obvious exfiltration, and an audit trail you can produce without panic. External collaboration is where least privilege becomes real, because you're now collaborating with identities you don't fully control, which is why the zone is not optional. It's the only way to separate internal collaboration ergonomics from external boundary enforcement without trying to do per-site exceptions forever. And yes, business units will ask, why can't we just enable external sharing on this one internal site? Because this one internal site becomes 50. Then 500, then it's normal, then your data classification doesn't mean anything because anything can be shared from anywhere with the right owner clicking the right button. That is the drift model. So scenario 3 starts with a design decision, not a tool decision. External collaboration happens in controlled zones with hardened defaults, and everything else is internal by default. Once that line exists, you can implement it with Entra B2B controls, conditional access, sensitivity labels, and DLP. And that's the next section. The architecture that makes cross-tenant collaboration survivable. Scenario 3. Architecture. Cross-tenant collaboration with least privilege and continuous audit. The architecture for external collaboration has one job: make working with outsiders behave like a controlled system, not a series of one-off exceptions. Start with Entra B2B, because that's where the boundary becomes enforceable. Guests need a defined onboarding path, and that path must be policy-driven. Who can invite? Which domains are allowed, what terms apply, and what happens when the sponsor disappears. A guest is not a user object you tolerate, it's a time-bound access allocation with an accountable human attached to it. That's why sponsorship and lifecycle matter more than the invite itself. If the sponsor leaves, access should not quietly persist. The system must trigger an access review, then remove the guest if no one reclaims ownership. That is not bureaucracy. It is how you prevent former partners still downloading files from becoming a quarterly tradition. Then conditional access. External collaboration without conditional access is just a shared folder with better marketing. Require MFA for guests. Block legacy authentication. Apply device controls where you can. And most importantly, separate the guest experience by zone. External collaboration sites should enforce stricter access conditions than internal project sites because the threat model is different. Treat this as deterministic. If it's a guest, the access decision is harder by default. Now, cross-tenant patterns. Most organizations default to B2B guests everywhere because it's familiar. But in some partner relationships, B2B Direct Connect makes sense. Two organizations with mature identity, deliberate trust, and a need for persistent collaboration without endless guest churn. The point isn't which feature wins. The point is boundary clarity. If you use Direct Connect, you document the trust relationship, you constrain it to the collaboration zone, and you monitor it like a production dependency, because that's what it is. Next, permissions. This is where entropy explodes, so the model has to be boring. Group-based access only. Guests assigned to guest access groups, never directly to SharePoint items. Owners assigned through owner groups, not individuals, and guest access should be limited to the minimum roles that make the project function. If a partner needs edit rights, fine, but granted through a controlled group that you can review and rotate, not through a pile of direct permissions that no one can inventory later. Then sensitivity labels, because they encode the collaboration contract into the content itself. In this zone, labels shouldn't be decorative. They should drive enforcement outcomes. Encryption, restricted sharing, and download controls where required. The label is how you prevent someone copied the file to a different site and now it's ungoverned from becoming the default data flow. When content moves, the label travels, and when the label travels, your policy intent travels. Auto-labeling can help here, but only inside boundaries you can defend. Models will misclassify, they always do, so use auto-labeling for obvious cases and high-confidence patterns, and make humans own exceptions. The worst design is pretending the model is a compliance officer. It isn't, it's a classifier with probabilistic outcomes. Now DLP. In external collaboration, DLP isn't optional friction. It's the runtime guardrail that stops the obvious leakage paths, PII copied into a partner space, regulated documents shared by link, or content exported through connectors that bypass SharePoint's native controls. And the stratification still applies. PII policies behave differently than source code policies. Your finance team's tolerance for false positives is not your engineering team's tolerance, designed for that reality. A key pattern here is allow with justification in the external zone, but only when the business has a defensible need. The justification isn't for feelings, it's for evidence. If an exception happens, you want a named human, a reason, and a timestamp you can query later. Otherwise, you don't have governance. You have vibes. Now, continuous audit. External collaboration is where you need near real-time detection, not end-of-quarter review. Stream the right signals. Guest invitations, guest sign-ins, link creation, sharing events, download spikes, permission changes, and DLP overrides. Then correlate them with identities. Which user, which guest, which service principal, which site, which label. If you can't join those dots, you can't investigate quickly and you will lose the narrative when something goes wrong. And watch for the specific anomalies that matter in cross-tenant work. A guest suddenly accessing a new site outside their normal zone, a wave of anonymous links appearing where they should be forbidden, or a service principal reading across multiple external sites in a short window. Those are not interesting logs. They're breach precursors. So the architecture closes the loop. Entra controls the identities, conditional access controls the sessions, group-based access controls the permissions, sensitivity labels control the content behavior, DLP controls the egress, and Sentinel controls the story you'll need when leadership asks what happened. Agents in the enterprise, where autonomy fits, where it must be caged. Now the part everyone wants to talk about, usually in the least useful way, agents. Most organizations treat agents like the next UI, a chat box bolted onto a site. Ask it anything about this library. That's fine, but it's not the enterprise problem. The enterprise problem is that agents turn SharePoint from a workflow surface into a decision surface, and decisions create liability when nobody can explain why they happened. So the framing is simple. Agents are interfaces first. They are not pipelines. They sit at the edge, helping humans find, summarize, and initiate. They do not replace deterministic enforcement. They do not own compliance outcomes. And they absolutely do not get to freestyle changes across systems because the prompt sounded confident. Where agents fit is the reasoning layer when the output is advisory or bounded. Knowledge retrieval on a site. Guided actions that map to approved workflows. Triage. Which policy applies? Who owns this? Where is the latest approved version? What template should we use? Which intake form is correct? Those tasks reduce cognitive load without changing system state. Everything clicked for enterprises. When they realize the pattern, the agent can decide what to ask, but it must not decide what to do. If it's going to do something, it does it through a cage. A controlled toolset with explicit permissions, explicit inputs, explicit logging, and an approval gate when the action crosses a boundary. That cage can be technical. A set of graph scopes limited to one site collection, read only by default, write actions routed through an orchestration service that validates policy and state before it commits. It can be organizational. Agents require sponsors, have life cycles, and get deleted when the sponsor disappears. But the cage must exist because autonomy without containment isn't innovation. It's conditional chaos. The other mistake is treating agents as smart users. They're not. In architectural terms, an agent is a non-human identity with tool access and a probabilistic reasoning engine. That means it inherits the two worst properties of enterprise systems. It can act quickly and it can be wrong quickly. So the enterprise model treats agents as identities, registered, permissioned, monitored, and reviewed. The same rules apply as with service principals and managed identities. Least privilege, group-based access, and zero standing privilege. If an agent needs to perform privileged actions, it does it under just-in-time elevation and logs every action with correlation IDs you can join in Sentinel. Now the risk model, because this is where leaders stop smiling. There's a failure triangle that always shows up with agents. Oversharing, untrusted input, and external actions. Oversharing means the underlying SharePoint permission model is messy and the agent faithfully surfaces what it can see. That's not an AI failure. That's your access model showing up at machine speed. Untrusted input means the agent reads content it didn't control, uploaded files, emails, partner documents, pages edited by anyone. If you don't assume malicious or misleading content will enter the system, you will eventually learn that assumption was wrong. External actions means the agent can call tools, send messages, change permissions, create links, move files, trigger flows. The moment an agent can act outside its own boundary, prompt injection stops being a theory and becomes an incident type. So the enterprise pattern is to break that triangle. You reduce oversharing with the group model, labels, and DLP you already built. You treat untrusted input as normal and sanitize what the agent can use as instructions. And you tightly constrain external actions, read before write, and write only through policy enforcement services. Now, a practical architecture view. Agents become entry points into your existing automation stack. A site agent can answer questions, then offer approved actions that map to quick steps or orchestrated workflows. A knowledge agent can propose metadata fixes, but humans confirm. An admin agent can surface drift signals, but enforcement runs through deterministic controls and logged remediations. That keeps your system stable. Humans get speed, but governance stays real. Because the truth is, agents don't reduce governance needs, they amplify them. The blueprint that survives growth. Scalable SharePoint automation isn't more flows or more AI, it's enforced intent. Entra identity, purview labels, DLP gates, and observable orchestration that converges instead of drifting. If you want the next layer, watch the episode on designing the Entra group model that prevents permission fanfiction because everything depends on that perimeter. Subscribe to M365 FM and connect with Mirko Peters on LinkedIn with your hardest SharePoint automation problem for a future breakdown.